She fed strangers in secret, nursed wounded men back to health, and gave her last flower to families who had nothing. And the one person she never expected to destroy her was the boy she had carried inside her own body for 9 months. At 68 years old, Margaret Ashcroft stood in the January wind with a bundle of clothes, watching her son lock the door of the home she had built with her own bleeding hands. No tears, no apology, just the sound of a bolt sliding shut. If this story moves you, stay until the end. Drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. The winter that took Edmund Ashcroft was not a dramatic one. There was no blizzard with howling winds that made for good storytelling later. No dramatic last stand against nature. Edmund simply grew quieter as the weeks passed, quieter at the dinner table, quieter in the mornings when he used to sit on the porch with his coffee and watch the sun come over the ridge. Then one Tuesday in late January, he didn't wake up at all. Margaret had lain beside him for several minutes before she understood what the stillness meant. His hand was already cold when she reached for it. They had been married 41 years. She did not scream. She did not collapse. She got up, put on her boots, and walked out to the barn to find their hired hand, a slow-talking boy named Denny, because Edmund would have wanted the livestock fed before anything else was dealt with. That was the kind of woman Margaret Ashcroft was, the kind who understood that grief was a private room you entered after the work was done. The burial was small. A few neighbors came through the snow. Old Pastor Hicks said the words. Silas stood beside his mother with his hat in his hands and his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the grave, as if he were already calculating something she couldn't see yet. She noticed it but said nothing. She told herself it was grief, that men carried grief differently, outward, restless, not knowing where to put their hands. Silas had never been an easy boy, even as a child. He had Edmund's jaw and his height, but none of his patience, none of that slow, deep steadiness that had made Edmund Ashcroft a man people trusted. Silas wanted things faster than the land could give them. Margaret had always known that. She had loved him anyway, the way you love something difficult, fully, stubbornly, and sometimes with your eyes closed. She gave him 2 weeks. 2 weeks to grieve his father. 2 weeks before she sat him down to talk about the spring planting, about what cattle to sell and what to keep, about which fence lines needed mending before the thaw turned everything to mud. 2 weeks felt right, generous even. He came to her first. It was a Thursday morning, barely past dawn. Margaret was at the stove when she heard his boots on the porch. That particular heavy tread he had, like he was always arriving somewhere important. She poured a second cup of coffee without thinking and set it on the table. An old habit. She had been pouring Silas a cup since he was tall enough to sit at that table. He didn't sit. He stood just inside the doorway with his hat still on, something Edmund would never have done in the house, and he said without any build-up at all, "I've been thinking about the property." Margaret set down her own cup. "All right," she said. "The ranch, the land, the cattle." He said it like he was reading from a list he had already memorized. "It all passes to me now. That's the law." "I know what the law says, Silas. I've been talking to some men about what it costs to run this place properly, to actually build something with it instead of just surviving year to year the way you and Papa—" He stopped himself, rephrased, "the way things have been done." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. She had brown eyes that had never quite lost their sharpness, even at 68, even after a winter that had taken everything. "What are you telling me?" He reached into his coat, set a folded piece of paper on the table without coming any closer. "There's a parcel, out past the eastern ridge, beyond the Holloway Creek crossing. It's on the deed, a portion of land that was never developed. Rocky ground, mostly. Not good for cattle, not good for much." She didn't touch the paper. "I'm telling you," he said, "that I think it makes more sense for you to have that portion, a smaller piece, something you can manage on your own. And the rest? Stays with the main estate, which I'll be running." The stove popped and hissed behind her. Outside, a crow landed on the fence post by the window and sat there like it was listening. "You're asking me to leave my home," Margaret said. "I'm offering you land of your own." "Land you don't want." He had the decency, at least, to look slightly uncomfortable. His jaw tightened. "I'm trying to be fair about this. Fair." She said the word the way you might pick up something wet from the ground. carefully, at a distance. "Your father built this house with his own hands, Silas. The two of us built it. I planted every one of those trees in the south field. I've buried 2 children in the ground between here and the creek, children who never made it past their first winter." Her voice stayed level. That was what frightened him, she could tell. Not anger, but her absolute steadiness. "This land is not just property to me. It's not practical," he said. You can't run a ranch alone. You're 68 years old. Your father was 66 and he was still stronger than you." Something flickered behind his eyes. Something sharp and defensive that told her she'd struck something true and that he would not forgive her for it. "I've made my decision," he said. He straightened. The discomfort left his face and something harder replaced it. Something she didn't quite recognize as her son. Or maybe she did recognize it, and that was worse. "You have until Sunday to collect what you need. I'll have Denny help you move your things." She stood very still. "The parcel beyond the ridge has an old cabin on it," he said. "Not much, but it's shelter. You won't be without a roof." "Silas." Her voice came out different now, quieter. Not begging. Margaret Ashcroft did not beg. But something raw moved beneath the surface of that single word. "I am your mother." He picked up his hat from where he'd never taken it off and turned toward the door. "I know that," he said. "But you're not a practical woman, Mama. You never have been. Papa let you make choices that cost this family for years, feeding strangers, giving away grain and milk to every hard-luck case that came through. We could have been further along than we are now." He opened the door. Cold air pushed into the kitchen. "This is a fresh start. For both of us." He left. The crow outside the window lifted from the fence post and disappeared. Margaret stood in the kitchen, where she had made perhaps 10,000 meals, where Edmund had carved the initials of their children into the underside of the table. A private thing. A foolish, tender thing. The kind of thing Silas never knew about because he had never looked that closely at anything. She stood there until the cold from the open door reached her feet, and then she quietly walked over and closed it herself. Sunday came the way bad days always do. Ordinary and indifferent, the sky a flat gray that gave nothing away. Denny helped her pack without looking at her face. He was a decent boy, Denny. He loaded her trunk into the wagon and didn't say a word the whole time, which was the kindest thing he could have offered. Silas had 2 men from town standing near the barn, watching, Margaret thought, though she couldn't figure out what exactly they thought she might do. Steal her own furniture? Pull up her own rose bushes, maybe. She took her clothes. She took the small wooden box where she kept Edmund's letters from before they were married. She took her sewing kit, her winter blankets, the iron skillet she'd used for 30 years, and the bag of cornmeal and dried beans that sat in the pantry. She took Edmund's old silver pocket watch from the top drawer of the dresser, the one he'd carried every day since before Silas was born, and slipped it into her coat pocket without examining it. Just the weight of it against her hip. That was enough. She did not take the rocking chair from the porch, even though it was hers, even though Edmund had made it for her the first winter of their marriage. It was too heavy for the wagon, and she would not give Silas the satisfaction of watching her struggle with it. She walked out without looking back at the house. It was not because she was strong. It was because if she looked back, she might not be able to keep walking, and she had made herself a quiet promise in the kitchen that she would not give her son the image of his mother breaking down in the yard. She had given him enough. The cabin beyond the eastern ridge was exactly what Silas had described. Not much. The walls stood, more or less. The roof had a section on the south side where the boards had rotted through and collapsed into a mess of timber and old snow. The door hung off one hinge. The floor inside was dirt, packed hard as clay, and something, a family of raccoons maybe, or something bigger, had been living under the far corner and left evidence of that arrangement scattered across the ground. It was February. The temperature at night dropped far below anything a person could survive without heat. Margaret stood in the doorway with her trunk behind her and looked at the inside of the place for a long time. The wagon was already gone. Denny had unhitched her horse, left her supplies, and turned back toward the main ranch without a word. He'd looked like a man who knew he was doing something wrong but didn't have the courage to say so. She didn't blame him. He had his own life to worry about. She led her horse, a brown mare named Ida, old and patient, and the only thing that had looked at her with any recognition this whole day, into the small lean-to beside the cabin that still had a solid roof. She piled what hay was left from the crumbling stack in the corner. She broke through the ice in the old water trough with the heel of her boot. Then she came back to the cabin. She found a dry corner near the remains of the old stone fireplace, piled her blankets there, and sat down on her trunk. The cold was already seeping through the walls in a way that meant business. She had a small amount of kindling, enough maybe to get a fire started if the flue wasn't blocked. It was blocked. Of course it was blocked. It took her the better part of an hour to clear it out, working with the length of stick she found in the debris. Her hands going numb and then past numb into something that simply hurt with every movement. But she cleared it, got a fire started, sat back and watched the smoke climb correctly up instead of billowing into the room. Small victories. She ate a little cornmeal mush that night. Not enough. She wasn't hungry, exactly. Grief has a way of sitting in the stomach and leaving no room for much else. But she ate because not eating would be a choice in the direction of giving up, and she had not made that choice yet. She lay down on her blankets on the dirt floor with Edmund's pocket watch in her hand. It was heavier than it should have been, she thought, distantly, half asleep. Or maybe it was just that her hands were worn out. She pressed her thumb against the engraved casing, felt the familiar scratched surface, the place where Edmund had dropped it once on a rock when they were young, and it had left a small dent in the silver. She did not open it, she just held it. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a low sound like breathing, and the fire settled into steady orange heat, and Margaret Ashcroft, who had survived 4 decades of frontier winters, 2 dead children, drought and bad harvests and sickness, lay on the floor of a wrecked cabin on a stretch of land her own son had thrown at her like table scraps, and she closed her eyes. She didn't know if she would be there in the morning. What she knew was that she had been cold before. She had been alone before. She had been close to the edge of things before, and had found her way back by simply putting one foot down in front of the other. She would try. That was all she had to offer the night. Just that. She would try. The next morning she woke up. She hadn't entirely expected it, and the fact of it, that gray cold light pushing through the gaps in the boards, Ida shuffling in the lean-to outside, the fire burned down to coals that still held the faintest warmth, felt less like survival and more like stubbornness that had outlasted the night. She fed Ida. She made water from snow she melted in the skillet. She ate a handful of dried beans cold because she was too tired to cook them. Then she looked around the cabin in full daylight for the first time. The south corner was a loss. That roof section would need to be rebuilt from the ground up before the next rain. The walls had gaps along 3 of the 4 seams where the original chinking had crumbled out over the years of no one living here. The door she could fix. The floor was just dirt, but it was level, and level dirt was workable. She could do things with this. She didn't know why that thought appeared or where it came from, because the rational part of her brain was still saying that she was 68 years old, alone, in the middle of February, with a lame hammer she'd found in the lean-to and half a bag of cornmeal between herself and starvation. But the thought was there. You could do things with this. She was on her knees pulling debris out of the collapsed corner when she heard the horse. She didn't move immediately. In this country, in these times, an unannounced rider could mean anything, and a woman alone on an isolated piece of land had reasons to be careful. She stayed where she was and listened to the sound of hoofbeats slow and stop outside. A knock on the open door. "Hello? Somebody in there?" A man's voice. Youngish. Careful. She straightened up slowly. Her knees hated her for it, and turned toward the doorway. He was broad-shouldered, somewhere in his 30s, with trail dust on his coat and a face that had spent a lot of years in the weather. He had his hat in his hand, and he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately read. Something between disbelief and something else. Something older and more complicated. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm sorry to bother you. I was riding the creek trail and I saw the smoke from the chimney. I didn't know this cabin was being used." "It wasn't," she said, "until a few days ago." He looked at her, at the fallen roof section, at the dirt floor, at the single iron skillet sitting on the stone hearth, and the trunk that was serving as both table and chair. Something changed in his face. "Margaret," he said. She blinked. How do you know my name?" He took a step inside. His eyes were doing something complicated, moving over her face, searching for something, finding it. "You won't remember me," he said. "I was just a boy, maybe 14, 15, skinny. I had a bad cut on my side from—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "From some trouble I was in. I came to your property in the middle of the night, and I was scared half to death, and I didn't know where else to go." She looked at him. "You hid me in your barn," he said. "You brought me food for 3 nights. You cleaned the wound and wrapped it tight with strips from an old sheet." He paused. "You told me not to make a sound when the men came looking, and you stood out in your own yard and told them you hadn't seen any boy, and they believed you." He held her gaze. "They believed you because you were the kind of woman people believe." The memory came back slowly. Not all at once. 20-something years was a long way to reach. But in pieces. A thin boy curled up in the hay, eyes too big for his face. The way she'd been terrified the whole 3 nights that Edmund would come home and see the blood on the barn floor and start asking questions she wasn't sure how to answer. "You had red hair," she said, "when you were a boy." Something crossed his face. Relief, maybe. Or the complicated thing that happens when a person is seen. "Still do," he said. "Under all the dust." He put his hat back on, looked around the cabin again, and this time his jaw was set in a way that meant he was measuring something, not judging, calculating. "My name is Colt Mercer," he said. "I've got a spread about 4 miles northwest. Good land, good cattle." He looked at her directly. "And I'm not leaving you here like this." Margaret had spent 41 years learning how to read Edmund, when he was tired, when he was worried, when he was saying one thing and meaning another entirely. She had gotten good at it, the way you get good at anything you practice every single day without thinking about it as practice. So she knew how to read people. She trusted that instinct. But Colt Mercer was standing in her doorway, saying he wasn't going to leave her here, and something in her chest pulled tight and defensive the way it does when you've been hurt recently enough that kindness feels like a trap. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "I know that." "I'm not looking for charity." "I know that too." He said it without irritation, which surprised her. Most men got impatient when a woman pushed back on something they'd decided was generous. Colt just stood there like he had time. "What I'm telling you is that I've got tools in my saddlebag and a pack horse about a 1/4 mile back on the trail that's carrying more food than I can eat before it spoils." He looked at the collapsed roof corner. "And I've been building and fixing things since I was old enough to hold a hammer. So unless you want to turn down the only help that's coming your way, maybe let me look at that roof." Mosigikito maset. She wanted to say no. She could feel it sitting in her throat. That stubborn refusal that had kept her standing up straight her whole life, through the hardest years, through loss and drought and disappointment. Independence was not just a value for Margaret Ashcroft. It was a survival tool. It was the thing that had let her walk out of her own home with her head level and her eyes dry. But the roof section was open to the sky, and it was February, and she was a practical woman. "Fine," she said. "Look at the roof." He nodded once and went back outside. She heard him ride out along the trail and return about 20 minutes later, the pack horse's load shifting and jingling as it came up through the trees. He unloaded it without asking her for help, which she appreciated, and he stacked things near the lean-to in a way that was organized but not fussy. Salt pork, dried corn, a sack of oats, coffee, a coil of rope, 2 wool blankets that looked newer than anything she owned, a canvas roll with tools inside. He didn't comment on any of it. He just started working. She watched him from the doorway for a while, not because she distrusted him, exactly, but because she hadn't quite caught up with the situation yet. 23 years, give or take. The boy she remembered had been desperately thin and frightened, with a gash across his ribs that she'd had to clean twice a day to keep it from going bad. And he'd had the face of someone who had already seen too much of the wrong kinds of things. She had given him what she had to give, which at that point had been some smoked meat, a clean bandage, and 3 days of not being found. She hadn't thought of it as anything remarkable. There had been a hurt boy hiding in her barn. You helped. She had not thought about him much afterward. She hadn't had the luxury. Life on the frontier was not the kind of life that left you a lot of room for wondering about the strays you'd helped along the way. And now here he was, 30-some years old, weathered and capable-looking, pulling rotted boards off her collapsed roof with his bare hands and tossing them into a pile with the efficiency of someone who had done hard physical work his whole life. She went inside and made coffee. It was the only thing she could think to do that made sense. She had coffee now, thanks to the pack horse, and the fire was burning well, and making coffee was an action that belonged to the ordinary world. The world where you made coffee for someone doing work around your property. The world where that was just a normal thing that happened. When he came inside to check the interior of the damaged wall, she handed him a cup without asking. He took it, drank, didn't make a face, which meant he was either polite or he genuinely didn't mind coffee made thin from rationing. "How long have you had the spread northwest of here?" she asked. "Bought it 6 years ago." He crouched down near the wall where the chinking had crumbled, pressing his fingers into the gaps, checking the depth. Built it up from nothing. Started with 40 cattle and a lot of debt. And now? 200 head, clean title. A bunkhouse with 3 hired men who show up when they're supposed to. He glanced up at her. It took a while. Good things usually do. He stood, moved to the next wall section, still reading the structure the way a person reads a face. "I heard about your husband. I'm sorry. Thank you. I heard some other things too." He said it carefully, not looking at her. "About the ranch passing to your son." She was quiet for a moment. The fire snapped. "People talk fast out here," she said. "Always have." He turned to face her then. He had dark eyes, not unkind, but direct in a way that took some getting used to. "Is that what happened? He pushed you out?" She thought about how to answer that. She could soften it. She could say it was complicated, that Silas had his reasons, that grief made people do strange things. She had told herself those things in the dark during those first nights on the dirt floor, turning them over like stones to see if there was any comfort underneath. There wasn't. "He gave me this parcel and told me to be out by Sunday," she said. "So I was out by Sunday." Colt looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face that he didn't let turn into words, which she respected. Sympathy was fine. Outrage on her behalf was something she didn't have the energy to manage right now. "All right," he said. "Then we'd better make this place livable." He spent 3 days. He hadn't planned on 3 days. She could tell that. He'd ridden out probably expecting to check on her, do what he could in an afternoon, and head back to his own work. But on the first day, the roof repair turned out to be bigger than it had looked from the outside, and by the time he'd gotten the structure sound and the boards replaced and the new pine pitch sealing the seams, the light was already going and it was too dark to ride 4 miles on an unfamiliar trail in winter. So he slept in the lean-to with the horses, rolled in his bedroll with the efficiency of a man who had slept in worse places and didn't consider it a hardship. Margaret offered him the cabin floor by the fire, and he waved it off without making it into a thing. "I've slept in the cold before," he said. "You haven't got enough fire in there to keep 2 people warm. You take it." She didn't argue. She needed the warmth more than her pride needed the victory. The second day he fixed the door, both hinges replaced, the frame re-squared, the gap at the bottom stuffed with a strip of leather he cut from a spare piece in his saddlebag. He re-chinked 3 of the 4 walls with a mixture of clay and dried grass he found along the creek bed. He showed her how he was mixing it while he worked, not in a condescending way, just talking through what he was doing the way people talk when they're working side by side and silence gets heavy. "You pack it in wet and it shrinks as it dries," he said, pressing a handful into a gap between 2 logs. "So you've got to overfill it a little. Comes out rough-looking, but it holds." "I've chinked walls before," she said. "I know, I'm just—" He paused. "Old habit. I talk when I work." So did Edmund. He looked over at her. She hadn't meant to say that. It had come out on its own, the way things did sometimes when your guard had been down for too many consecutive days. "What was he like?" Colt asked. He said it simply, no particular delicacy to it, which was the right way to ask. She thought about it. "Stubborn," she said. "Patient. Funny when he wanted to be, which wasn't as often as I would have liked." She picked up a handful of the clay mixture and filled a gap in the wall section beside her. "He had this quality. I don't know the right word for it. He made you feel like the problem in front of you had a solution, even when it didn't. Even when things were genuinely bad, he had this way of just looking at it, and that was enough." Colt nodded slowly. "That's a rare thing in a person." "It is." She pressed the clay flat with her thumb. "I didn't know how much I relied on it until it was gone." They worked in silence for a while after that. Not uncomfortable silence. Just the kind that settles between people who have shared something honest. On the second evening, he cooked. He had a way with the salt pork and dried corn that was basic but not bad. Better than her cornmeal mush, anyway. and they sat on opposite sides of the fire and ate from the same iron skillet because she only had the one. "You never married?" she asked. He shook his head. "Came close once. Woman in Abilene. She decided she'd rather have a man whose work kept him in one place." He said it without visible bitterness. "She wasn't wrong about what she wanted. We just wanted different things. Do you regret it?" "Sometimes." He pushed the food around the skillet. "Less than I used to." She looked at him across the fire. The light played off the side of his face, and for a second she could almost see the boy underneath. That same watchful quality, that same stillness. He had learned, somewhere along the way, how to be quiet without seeming closed. That was its own kind of skill. "Those men who were looking for you," she said, "back when you were hiding in my barn. What happened with them?" He was quiet for a moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer. "They found me eventually," he said. "Not at your place. A few weeks later, further east." He set the skillet down. "There were 3 of them. I managed to get away from 2. The third one," he paused. "Let's say he stopped being a problem." She held his gaze. "How old were you?" 15 by then. She let that sit for a moment. 15 years old, alone in the frontier, dealing with grown men who wanted to do him harm. She thought about what it meant to survive that, what it cost you, what it left behind. And she didn't ask anything more about it. Some things were answered fully enough. "You've done all right for yourself," she said instead. Something in him seemed to release slightly. "I've tried." On the 3rd morning, she woke before him for the first time, which meant her body was starting to trust that there would be mornings. She made the fire up from the coals before the cold had fully settled in the room, which was a small victory she noted privately. She made coffee. She stood at the repaired door, which now opened and closed properly, a sensation so mundane and so unexpectedly moving that she had to stand there for a moment, just working the latch back and forth, and she looked out at the gray pre-dawn light on the snow. The land, she noticed for the first time without the weight of despair pressing down on everything she saw, had a shape to it. Rocky, yes. Silas hadn't lied about that. The soil in the section she could see from the doorway was thin and pale, not the dark loamy earth of the main ranch. The terrain rose and dipped unevenly, but there was a line of trees along the western edge that meant water somewhere nearby. A spring or a creek branch, and the valley-like depression between 2 low ridges would hold warmth in the summer months. She had grown things in worse ground. Colt came in from the lean-to with his hair still flattened from sleep, stamping the cold off his boots at the door. "Coffee's ready," she said. He took a cup and stood beside her at the doorway, looking out at the same landscape. He didn't say anything for a while. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Whether that depression between the ridges would drain properly in a wet spring." He looked at her. She saw the corner of his mouth move. "You're thinking about planting," he said. "I'm thinking about surviving," she said. "Same thing, out here." He drank his coffee, looked out at the land again with that measuring quality she'd been watching in him for 3 days. The way he looked at a problem and began taking it apart without saying anything out loud yet. "The ridge blocks the north wind," he said. "That's something." "I noticed that? Rocky ground's harder to work, but it drains faster. Less rot in a wet year." He tilted his head slightly. "You'd want to clear those stones out of the lower section and pile them. Use them for a foundation if you ever build anything permanent." "I already live here," she said. "This is the permanent thing." He glanced at her. Something passed between them. Not pity, not that, but a kind of acknowledgement. She wasn't being tragic about it. She was being factual. This was where she was, and she would work with what it gave her. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm telling you about the stones." She let herself almost smile. Almost. He left that afternoon. He had cattle to check on and men waiting on his direction, and she understood that. He had already given 3 days of his time and a pack horse full of supplies, and she was not the kind of person who needed someone to stay past what was sensible. But at the edge of the tree line, where the trail bent back northwest toward his spread, he stopped his horse and turned. "I'm going to come back," he said. "Week from now. Maybe sooner if the weather holds." She stood in the doorway of her repaired cabin. "You don't have to." "I know." He settled his hat against the wind. "I'm going to anyway." She watched him until the trees closed around him and the sound of hoofbeats faded down the trail. Then she turned back inside and stood in the middle of the room. Her room, her floor, her fire, and let out a long, slow breath that she felt she'd been holding for about 2 weeks. The door stayed shut against the wind. The fire held. Outside, the snow was beginning to melt at the edges, just a little, along the south-facing rocks where the afternoon sun hit longest. Not enough to matter yet. Not spring? Nowhere close. But the ice was losing its grip by small degrees, the way things do when the season is beginning to turn. She picked up Edmund's silver pocket watch from where she'd set it on the mantelpiece and held it in her palm, feeling the familiar weight of it. She still hadn't opened it, not since the cabin. She ran her thumb over the scratched casing, over the small dented place where he'd dropped it on the rock all those years ago. She would open it when she was ready. She set it back on the mantelpiece, pulled on her coat, went outside to check on Ida and to start figuring out exactly how far the property line ran along the base of the eastern ridge, and to see whether that line of trees to the west was hiding a spring or just sitting there for appearances. She had things to figure out. That was better than the alternative. The spring came late and mean that year, the way springs sometimes do on the frontier, teasing at the edges of winter for weeks before actually committing, giving you a few warm days and then pulling them back like a hand offering something and then closing into a fist. The snow melted and refroze and melted again. The ground went from iron hard to soft mud to something in between that sucked at your boots and made every step feel like an argument. Margaret didn't wait for it to make up its mind. She had spent the remainder of February and all of March learning her land the way you learn a difficult person. Slowly, through trial and frustration, finding the places where it would cooperate and the places where it simply wouldn't. The spring she'd suspected behind the western tree line turned out to be real. A clean, cold source that fed a narrow creek running south along the base of the ridge before disappearing into the ground somewhere near the property's lower edge. Clean water. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, the difference between a place worth fighting for and a place worth abandoning. She was not abandoning anything. Colt came back the following week as he'd said he would, and then the week after that, and then, without either of them making a particular decision about it, he was coming 2 or 3 times a week. He always brought something: a load of firewood cut from his own timber, extra cornmeal, once a young laying hen in a wooden crate that he carried balanced across his saddle for 4 miles without complaint. "You didn't have to do that," she said, looking at the hen. "She wasn't earning her keep at my place," he said. "Stubborn bird. Won't lay with the others? Figured she might do better with some privacy." Margaret looked at the hen, who looked back at her with the particular expression of a creature that had opinions about its circumstances. "I know the feeling," she said. Colt made a sound that might have been a laugh, short and genuine, and went to set up the crate in the lean-to corner while Margaret stood there, realizing that was the first actual joke she'd made in 2 months, and that it had come out without her planning it. That seemed like a sign of something. She named the hen Vera. Vera laid 1 egg every 2 days with grim consistency, and Margaret treated each one like it was made of something valuable, which out here, in February and March, it very nearly was. The work between her and Colt developed its own rhythm without them designing it. He had his own ranch to run, his own livestock and hired men, and the 1,000 small decisions that came with running 200 head of cattle across 4 miles of frontier land. He wasn't her hired hand, and she never treated him that way. But when he came, they worked together on whatever the land required, clearing rocks from the lower field section, shoring up the lean-to's foundation, digging out the creek bank in 2 places where it was silting up and starting to pool wrong. He worked without being directed, and she worked without explaining herself, and they moved around each other in the space with the ease of people who had, in some fundamental way, already figured each other out. She noticed she was sleeping better. She didn't say that to anyone. She just noticed it. It was the first week of April when the pocket watch stopped cooperating. She had gotten into the habit of keeping it on the mantelpiece during the day and in her coat pocket when she was working outside, not for any practical reason, since she rarely needed to know the exact time, but because the weight of it felt grounding. Familiar. The closest thing she had to Edmund still present in a physical way. She was cleaning it one evening, just wiping the casing down with a cloth the way you do when you've been handling something regularly and the oils from your skin have built up on the surface, when she felt it. A slight unevenness. Not in the casing itself, but behind it, in the backplate, where the silver had always felt uniformly smooth to her thumb. She turned it toward the firelight and looked more closely. There was a seam she had never noticed, shallow, nearly invisible, running along the inner edge of the back plate in a way that didn't match the standard construction of the watch. She had handled this watch thousands of times over 40 years. She knew every scratch on its surface. She could not explain how she had never noticed this seam before, except that you don't look for hidden things in objects you trust completely. She pressed her thumbnail against the seam. The back plate gave, not by much, barely a millimeter, but enough to tell her it was meant to move. She set the watch flat on the trunk lid and worked at the edge more carefully, and after a minute the false back plate released and swung open on a tiny concealed hinge. Inside the cavity was small, room for almost nothing, but the two things it held had been protected for what looked like years. A brass key, no larger than her little finger, on a loop of thin cord, and a piece of paper folded into quarters so small it was barely the size of a thumbnail. She sat very still for a moment. Then she unfolded the paper. Edmund's handwriting. She would have known it in total darkness. He wrote in that compact, slanted way of his, letters pressed firmly into the page as if he wanted them to stay put. The paper was old, not ancient, but old enough that the fold lines had gone soft and the ink had faded from black to a dark brown at the edges. She brought it close to the firelight. It was a map. Rough, clearly drawn from memory rather than surveyed, but precise in the way that Edmund had always been precise. Every landmark named, every distance estimated, every direction marked with a small compass rose in the upper corner that he'd drawn freehand and probably agonized over. She recognized the shape of the eastern ridge immediately. She recognized the creek line, and there, at the lower section of the land he had apparently given her on purpose, not thrown away, given, deliberately and with forethought, there was a mark. A small rectangle, shaded with a crosshatch pattern, and the word vault written beneath it in Edmund's careful hand, and below that, in smaller letters. For when you need it, and you will know when. She read those 7 words 4 times. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the trunk lid and breathed until they stopped. Edmund Ashcroft had known. Somehow, in the way that a man who had spent 40 years watching the world understands certain things about how the world works. He had known that something might come apart. He had hidden something in this land. He had hidden the key inside the watch he knew she would keep, and he had given her this exact piece of ground, this apparently worthless, rocky, no good stretch of frontier that his own son had dismissed without a second look, because the thing he wanted to protect was here. She sat by the fire for a long time without moving. Then she put the key on its cord around her neck, tucked it under her collar, refolded the map, and placed it inside her dress pocket. She closed the false back plate of the watch. She set it on the mantelpiece. She did not sleep that night. She waited for Colt, not because she needed him to find it. She was capable of reading a map and following it, and the location marked was perhaps a quarter mile from the cabin, down in the lower field section they'd already half cleared of rocks. But she found, sitting with the secret through the long night, that she didn't want to find it alone. That was a new feeling for her. She had spent so much of her life being self-sufficient that wanting company for something felt almost like a weakness, and she turned it over in the dark trying to decide if it was. She concluded it wasn't. It was just true. She didn't want to be alone when she opened a door that Edmund had left for her. She wanted one other person there. It didn't seem like too much to ask from the world. Colt arrived 2 days later on a gray Thursday morning with a load of fence posts he'd cut from his timber. He'd been talking about helping her run a proper fence line along the eastern property edge, and he'd apparently just gone ahead and cut the posts without asking, which was the kind of thing that would have annoyed her if she'd had the energy for it, and which she had come to understand was simply how he operated. He showed up with things. It was his nature. She was waiting for him in the yard. He looked at her face and stopped what he was doing with the fence posts. "What happened?" he said. She had thought about how to explain it. She had run through several versions in her head during the 2 days of waiting, orderly, beginning-to-end versions that would make sense to someone hearing it fresh. But what came out was simpler than any of them. "Edmund hid something," she said. "In the watch. A map." She pulled the folded paper from her pocket. "There's something buried on this land. He put a vault here. I don't know when, I don't know how long ago, but he knew what Silas was. He planned for this." Colt took the map from her. "Read it." His expression was careful in a way that meant he was processing something unexpected and not letting the surprise run ahead of his thinking. "You know where this is?" he asked. "The lower field, where we've been clearing rocks." He looked up at her. "You've been walking over it for 2 months. Apparently." He folded the map and handed it back to her. Didn't say anything excessive about it, didn't perform astonishment. Just looked at her and said, "You want to go find it now?" "Yes," she said. "Right now." The lower field in early April was a mess of half-frozen mud and exposed rock, the ground still making up its mind about what season it wanted to be. They had cleared maybe a third of the larger stones from the section closest to the cabin, piling them along the south edge to use as foundation material later. The rest of the field was still rough and cluttered, the ground rising and dipping in that uneven way of land that had never been properly worked. Margaret walked the map's distances with Colt beside her, counting paces from the creek bend the way Edmund had marked it, 23 paces east-southeast, then 16 north. She had to stop twice and recount because the mud was pulling at her boots and making it hard to keep a consistent stride. Colt held the map and called out corrections without making it feel like he was taking over, which she appreciated more than she said. They stopped. "Here," she said. The ground beneath them looked exactly like the ground 20 feet in any direction. Pale, rocky, unremarkable. A cluster of larger stones sat just to the right, the kind of natural arrangement you'd walk past 100 times without thinking anything of it. Except, she crouched down and looked at the stones more carefully. They were large, 4 or 5 of them, each the size of a man's torso, arranged in a rough arc. She had noticed them before and dismissed them as natural formation, but looking now with the map in her mind, she could see that the spacing was too even. The positioning was too deliberate. Someone had put these stones here, and had put them here specifically to look like they hadn't. "Help me move this one," she said, pointing to the largest. It took both of them, and it was not graceful. She threw her back into it alongside Colt, and they shifted the stone in stages, working it sideways through the mud until it rolled clear. Her knees were soaked through. Her hands were raw. She didn't care. Beneath the stone was hard-packed earth, but at the edges, she could see where the ground had been disturbed years ago and had settled unevenly. A rectangular depression, subtle, maybe 4 feet by 3 feet, that you'd only notice if you were looking specifically for it. Colt had already picked up the short-handled spade he'd brought from the wagon on instinct when she'd told him what they were looking for. He started working at the edges first, feeling for resistance. 3 inches down, his spade hit something solid that was not rock. They looked at each other. He kept digging. Margaret got on her knees in the mud and started clearing the loosened earth away with her hands. Not because it was faster. It wasn't. But because she needed to be doing something with her hands right now. The cold of the mud barely registered. What they uncovered over the next 30 minutes of hard work was a wooden hatch frame set flush into the earth, the wood blackened and old but still solid, treated with something, pine tar probably, that had protected it from the moisture. An iron hasp on the front edge, and in the hasp, a keyhole. Margaret sat back on her heels. Her hands were completely brown with mud. She reached inside her collar and pulled out the brass key on its cord. "Edmund," she said quietly, not to Colt, not to anyone in particular. Just the name, just that, the way you might say the name of someone you're thinking about when you're alone. She fit the key into the hasp. It turned. The hatch required both of them to pull open against the suction of the settled earth around its frame, and it came with a sound that was somewhere between a groan and a gasp, as if the space beneath had been holding its breath. A smell came up, cold and old and dry, a dark underground smell. But beneath it something metallic and close, a ladder, iron rungs set into the earth wall, led down maybe 8 feet into solid darkness. Colt pulled a short candle from his coat pocket. He was the kind of person who carried candles, Margaret was coming to understand, because he was the kind of person who thought about what he might need before he needed it, and lit it from the small striker he kept on his belt. He looked at her. "You go first," he said. "It's yours." She took the candle. She went down the ladder 1 rung at a time, feeling the cold close around her as she descended, the candlelight spreading in a small orange circle that grew larger the wider the space opened below her feet. She stepped off the last rung onto a flat stone floor. She held the candle up. The vault was perhaps 15 feet across and 10 feet deep, the walls lined with fitted stone that spoke of someone who had known what they were doing when they built it. No hasty construction, no cutting corners. Along the left wall, 3 wooden chests, bound in iron, the kind built to last rather than to look impressive. Along the right wall, a rack of some kind, largely empty, but with 2 bundles of what had once been premium beaver fur, still intact, preserved by the cold and dark, wrapped in treated canvas. At the back wall, laid flat and sealed in oilskin, a roll of documents that might have been a map, or papers, or both. And in the first chest, which she pulled open with hands that were steady only because she made them be steady, row upon row of Spanish gold coins packed in straw and oilcloth, and beneath them the flat heavy gleam of silver bullion in 6-inch bars, and beneath that, folded but still crisp, a set of papers with the territorial seal that she recognized as the kind of documents that talked about land and legal ownership and the rights that go with both. She stood in the vault that Edmund had built and filled and sealed and hidden in the ground of the land he had arranged for her to have, and the cold air wrapped around her, and the candle threw its small, uncertain light across all of it, and she pressed one muddy hand against the stone wall to keep herself from sitting down on the floor. Colt's boots appeared on the ladder above her. "Margaret?" His voice came down carefully. "You all right?" "Yes," she said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. "Come down. You need to see this." He came down the last rungs and stepped beside her and went very quiet for a long time, looking at what the candlelight was showing him. She watched his face instead of the chests. She already knew what was there, and his reaction felt like the more important thing right now, the thing that would tell her whether she was understanding the size of this correctly. He let out a long, slow breath. "How long has this been here?" he said. "I don't know. Years. Maybe many years. Edmund never said a word." Colt shook his head slowly. "He built this by himself." "He must have." She looked around the space again. "In secret. Probably a little at a time over seasons. He was patient that way. He could hold on to something a long time if he thought it mattered." "He knew about Silas," Colt said. "He knew what Silas was becoming." She closed the lid of the chest. The sound of it was definitive in the cold air. "He just loved him too much to say it out loud, so he prepared instead." Colt was looking at the documents laid flat in their oilskin casing against the back wall. "Those papers," he said. "Have you looked at them?" "Not yet." He went to them carefully, broke the seal on the oilskin, and unrolled the top layer. She brought the candle close. The territorial seal was unmistakable, and beneath it, Edmund's name and hers, and the description of the parcel, this exact parcel, exactly as it had been deeded to her. And below that, language that a legal mind had clearly written, language about ownership and rights, and what passed to whom, and under what conditions. And a signature from a territorial notary dated 11 years prior. 11 years ago, Edmund had come to this land and built this vault and filled it and sealed it and buried it and deeded the land specifically to her, not to the estate, not to Silas, to Margaret Ashcroft directly, with provisions that were clear enough to hold up in front of any magistrate with the sense to read what the page actually said. Silas had not thrown away worthless land. Silas had thrown away his inheritance without knowing it. She stood there in the underground vault, with the candle burning down in her hand and the cold coming up through the stone floor into her feet and the weight of the brass key still around her neck. And she thought about Edmund sitting across from her at their kitchen table every morning for 41 years, steady and patient, and holding on to things in that quiet way of his. And she felt something that was not quite grief and not quite gratitude, but was made of both of those things pressed together into something harder than either one alone. "He knew I'd figure it out," she said. "He knew I'd open the watch eventually." "He knew you," Colt said simply. She blew out the candle, not because she needed to. There was enough light filtering down from the open hatch above, but because she needed to do something with her hands, and that was what was nearest. The darkness settled around them for a moment before her eyes adjusted. "We need to be careful," she said, and her voice had changed now. The feeling was still there, but something practical had come up through it, the way it always did with Margaret when the feeling had been felt, and it was time to move. "Nobody can know about this yet, not until I understand exactly what those documents say and what they protect." "Agreed," Colt said. He was looking at her in the low light with that direct, unreadable quality he had. Nobody knows this land but you and me. We keep it that way until you're ready. She nodded, reached for the ladder. Colt. She stopped with her hand on the iron rung, didn't look back at him, just spoke into the middle distance of the vault, into the dark. He would have liked you, she said. Edmund. He had a good sense about people. A beat of silence. I'm glad, Colt said. I'd have liked to know him. She climbed the ladder out of the ground and into the gray April light, and the world above felt different than the one she'd left when she climbed down. Same sky, same mud, same half-cleared field with its stubborn rocks. But the ground beneath her feet had stopped being a burden and started being something else entirely, something worth defending. They kept it quiet for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of working the land like nothing had changed, which was harder than it sounded because everything had changed, and they both knew it. Colt continued coming to the property with the same regularity, the same practical loads of supplies and fence posts, and the occasional problem he'd solved before she had to ask. Margaret continued clearing the lower field, continued tending to Vera and to Ida, continued mapping the spring line and deciding where a proper kitchen garden could go once the ground was ready. From the outside, if anyone had been watching, and in frontier settlements there was always someone watching, it looked like an old woman and a neighboring rancher doing the slow work of making a rough piece of land livable. That was the idea. The documents from the vault were the first thing Margaret dealt with, and she dealt with them methodically. She spread them on the trunk lid by firelight and read every line 3 times, which was tedious and slow because the legal language was dense and full of the kind of phrasing that meant something specific in a courthouse and something vague everywhere else. But she had been married to a careful man, and Edmund had been careful about this too. He had not trusted the language to a settler who wrote contracts on kitchen tables. The notary seal was from the territorial office. The signatures were witnessed and dated, and the deed language was specific in a way that mattered. The parcel was deeded to Margaret Eleanor Ashcroft as sole owner, without conditions of marriage or survivorship, in her own right and name. That last phrase, in her own right and name, Edmund had underlined, just once, lightly, in pencil. She ran her finger over it. He had known that Silas would use the law if he could. He had closed that door first. She wrote a letter to the territorial magistrate's office in the county seat, a 3-day ride east. She did not explain everything. She explained enough. That she had documents pertaining to a land deed that required official review, that she wished to schedule an appointment, that the matter was time-sensitive. She gave it to Colt to post when he rode to the settlement for supplies, and she told him to post it from the settlement office and not to mention where it had come from. You think Silas has someone watching the mail? Colt asked. I think Silas has someone watching most things, she said. He always wanted information before other people had it, even as a boy. He thought it gave him an advantage. Does it? Sometimes. She folded the envelope and handed it to him. Not this time. The reply came back in 10 days. The magistrate would arrive in the settlement on the 15th of May to hear several land disputes already on his calendar. He would see Mrs. Ashcroft on the morning of the 16th. Margaret read the letter twice, folded it, and put it with the documents in the oilskin casing she kept hidden under the floorboards of the cabin, in the corner where the stone of the old fireplace foundation met the wall. She told no one else. Not yet. The problem with secrets on the frontier is that the frontier is not a large place in the ways that matter. People move through it. Trappers, traders, hired hands looking for seasonal work, travelers passing through settlements. Information travels faster than horses because information doesn't need to rest. And somewhere in those 3 weeks, something leaked. She never found out exactly where or how. Maybe Denny had said something to someone. Maybe one of Colt's hired men had ridden past the property at the wrong moment and seen things that added up to a question. Maybe Silas himself had simply been watching more carefully than she'd accounted for. The first sign was a rider who came through the Eastern Trail on a Tuesday afternoon in early May, moving slowly, not stopping, but looking. Not the casual look of a traveler checking his bearings, a measuring look, the kind of look that was gathering information for someone else. Margaret watched him from inside the cabin through the gap in the door and said nothing. When he was gone, she walked out to the lean-to, saddled Ida, and rode the 4 miles northwest to Colt's spread. She had never come to him before. It had always been him coming to her. He looked up from the corral where he was working a young horse on a lead line and took one look at her face and dropped the lead to his hired man without a word of explanation. "Come inside," he said. She told him about the rider. He sat at his kitchen table and listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she had come to value about him. Men who interrupted while you were still talking were men who had already decided what they thought before you finished saying it. Colt waited until she was done. "It's not necessarily Silas," he said. "It's Silas," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Didn't argue. "How long until the magistrate?" 11 days. He nodded slowly, working something through in his head. 11 days is workable. What do you need? She had thought about this on the 4-mile ride over, which was why she'd come instead of sending a message. "I need people," she said. "Not to fight. I'm not starting a fight, and I'm not giving Silas an excuse to claim we threatened him. But if he rides in with armed men and it's just the two of us on that property, the documents don't matter much. A woman and a rancher against 8 men with rifles is not a legal dispute. It's something else. So we need witnesses," Colt said. "People who'll stand there and make it a public thing. People who know what Silas did," she said. "People who have reasons of their own to stand in that yard." He was quiet for a moment. Then he pushed back from the table and stood up, and she recognized the particular quality of that movement. It was the stance of a man who had made a decision and was already thinking about what came next. "I know who to talk to," he said. Colt Mercer had been in this territory for 6 years, and in 6 years he had done what men of genuine character tend to do without planning it. He had accumulated goodwill. Not by performing generosity, but by being a fair dealer, by paying his debts on time, by never misrepresenting his cattle at market, and by being the kind of neighbor who showed up when someone else's barn burned down and didn't wait to be asked. He knew people. They were not all his friends exactly, but they respected him, which in this country was sometimes worth more than friendship. He spent 4 days riding. Margaret stayed on the property and worked and did not let herself think too much about what Silas might be planning because thinking too much about it would not speed up the calendar. She tended to Vera and Ida. She planted the kitchen garden in the patch of ground along the south-facing wall where the thin soil was deepest. Beans, squash, and a row of root vegetables that would take all summer but would be there in the fall if the fall came the way she intended it to. She went down into the vault twice, not to take anything, but to check that it was still secure, still undisturbed, and to sit with the knowledge of it for a few minutes each time. It helped somehow being close to what Edmund had left for her. It made the 11 days feel more manageable. On the 6th of May, 9 days before the magistrate was due, Silas came. She heard the horses before she saw them. More than 2, the sound of a group moving with the particular coordination of men who had been told to move together. She was in the garden when the sound reached her. She straightened up, set her trowel down in the dirt, did not run inside, did not call out. She stood in her garden and waited. There were 7 of them. Silas at the front on the bay horse he'd always favored. Edmund's horse, she noticed, which hit her somewhere under the ribs, but she held her expression flat. 2 men she recognized from the settlement, Harlan Briggs, who ran the feed store and had always been willing to extend credit to people he thought were worth it, which apparently now included Silas, and a thick-armed man named Cord, who did various kinds of work for various kinds of people and had a reputation for not asking questions. The other 4 were strangers. They had the look of hired muscle, not outlaws exactly, but men who had learned to make themselves useful to whoever was paying. Silas pulled up 20 feet from where she stood. He looked at the cabin. The repaired roof, the new door, the chinked walls, the lean-to with its reinforced structure. And something moved across his face that might have been surprise. He had expected to find her diminished. He had expected what he'd left her with to have done its work. "Mama," he said, flat. Not a greeting, just a word. "Silas." She matched his tone exactly. "You've come a long way from the main ranch." "I've been hearing things," he said, "about this property." He looked past her at the lower field, at the section she'd been clearing. His eyes moved over it in that calculating way, the same way she'd watched him look past his father's grave. "I want to have a look around." "This is private property," she said. "It's—" He stopped himself. Restarted with the controlled quality of someone who had rehearsed. "There's some question about the status of this parcel, whether it was properly transferred or whether it's still part of the main estate. There's no question, she said. I disagree. What you believe doesn't change what the documents say. He went still. What documents? She had not planned to say that. Or maybe she had and hadn't admitted it to herself. But the word was out now, and she watched what it did to his face. A rapid tightening, something calculating, firing behind his eyes. There are documents from your father's estate that I haven't been able to account for, he said, and his voice had changed, the controlled surface sliding a little. Records. Land records. I've been through his papers, and there are things missing. Edmund kept his own counsel, she said. That was his right. Not if it affects the estate's legal standing. He nudged his horse a half step forward. I need to come onto this property, Mama. I need to look at what you've got here. You are not welcome on this property. She said it without raising her voice, clear, level, and final. The thick-armed man named Cord shifted in his saddle. One of the strangers moved his horse sideways slightly, the kind of movement that was positioning rather than restlessness. Silas looked at her for a long moment. You can't stop me, he said. There are 7 of us. I can count, she said. She did not move. She stood in her garden with her hands at her sides, 68 years old, 5 feet and 3 inches of her, with dirt on her knees and Edmund's key around her neck, and she looked at her son and did not flinch. It was Silas who moved first. He stepped his horse forward, and then a voice came from the tree line to the west. I'd stop there. Colt rode out of the tree line at a walk. Not rushing, not dramatic, just coming out of the trees the way you come through a door. Behind him, one by one, other riders emerged. Margaret counted without letting herself look too openly. 8, 9, 10. Men she half recognized and men she didn't, on horses of various quality, armed the way frontiermen are generally armed, which is to say sufficiently. At the edge of the group she recognized Harlan Briggs's brother Tom, who had apparently decided his loyalties did not follow his brother's. She saw 2 men she recognized as the Calloway brothers from the northern tracts, who had come through drought together with her and Edmund 8 years ago and eaten at her table more than once. She saw a trapper named Augustin, who she hadn't spoken to in 3 years, but who apparently had a memory for things. And she saw others, women even, which surprised her. 2 women from the settlement on horseback with their husbands, women she had sat with at sick beds and helped through difficult labors and traded dried goods with in the thin years. They were not armed. They were simply there, which was its own kind of statement. Silas's 7 men looked at the assembled group, and the arithmetic settled over the yard like weather. This is not your fight, Mercer, Silas said. His voice was still controlled, but the edges of it had gone tight. She helped me once when she didn't have to, Colt said. He had stopped his horse and was sitting easy in the saddle, hands visible, not reaching for anything. I'm returning the consideration. Same goes for everyone behind me. You're interfering in a family matter. No! It was Tom Briggs who said it, from the edge of the group, in the flat voice of a man who had thought about what he wanted to say. You're trying to take from an old woman what's legally hers. That's not a family matter. That's just theft. Silas turned his head toward Cord. Something passed between them, a question and an answer, wordless. Cord looked at the assembled riders and then looked back at Silas and gave the faint, almost imperceptible shake of a man who is being paid well, but not that well. The magistrate comes to the settlement in 9 days, Margaret said. She had not moved from where she stood. There will be a formal hearing. The documents will be presented. The deed will be reviewed. That is how this will be settled. In front of the law, in front of witnesses, in front of the settlement. She looked at Silas directly. That is the only way this will be settled. Silence. The horses shifted. Somewhere in the trees a woodpecker was working at something, utterly indifferent to what was happening in the yard below. You don't know what those papers say, Silas said, and underneath the control his voice had gone thin in a way she recognized from when he was a boy, that specific thinness that meant he was scared. You don't understand the legal language. I read them 3 times, she said. Your father wrote clearly when it mattered. Something broke on his face then, not dramatically. No collapse, no visible crumbling. Just a slight rearrangement of his features. A subtle shift that told her the calculation behind his eyes had just come out wrong, and he knew it. He turned his horse. Did not say goodbye. Did not say anything. The men behind him fell in without needing instruction, and Silas Ashcroft rode back down the eastern trail with his hired men around him, and the yard watched them go. And nobody said a word until the sound of hoofbeats had thinned to nothing in the distance. Colt rode up beside her, looked down at her from the saddle. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. She meant it. Behind them, the gathered riders were beginning to talk among themselves. The particular release of tension that comes when something difficult has passed without becoming worse. Tom Briggs had climbed down from his horse and was already explaining something to the Calloway brothers. The two women from the settlement had ridden up to the edge of the garden and were looking at it with the assessing eyes of people who grew things for a living. One of them, a broad-faced woman named Ruth Ann Collier, who had 3 children and a husband who did his best, and a garden that was the envy of the northern settlement, leaned forward in her saddle and looked at the bean rows Margaret had put in. "You'll want to mound those higher," she said. "The drainage on this slope will pull water away from the roots on a heavy rain." Margaret looked at the rows, looked back at Ruth Ann. "I know," she said. "I was going to get to it." Ruth Ann nodded, satisfied. "We came out here because Mercer asked us to," she said. "But some of us also remember when you helped us, Margaret Ashcroft, and we don't forget it either." She glanced toward where Silas had disappeared down the trail. "A man who'd do that to his own mother." She made a short, dismissive sound that expressed her opinion more completely than a paragraph could have. "His father would be ashamed." Margaret didn't answer that. She pressed her lips together and looked at the trail's empty bend and felt the weight of the brass key against her collarbone and agreed, privately and quietly, that yes, Edmund would have been ashamed. And then she let that go, because Edmund was gone, and what remained was what always remained after everything else was stripped away: the work and the land and the people willing to stand in the yard. She turned to the assembled riders, looked at each of them: Colt's neighbors, her old neighbors, strangers who'd come because of what Colt had told them and had apparently found it sufficient reason. "Come inside," she said. "I have coffee, and it's not enough for this many people, but you'll get some." The days between Silas's visit and the magistrate's arrival had a particular quality to them. Not quite calm, not quite tense, but something in between, like the air before a storm that hasn't decided yet whether to break. She slept with Edmund's documents under the floorboards and the key around her neck, and she woke each morning and did what needed doing, because that was what there was to do. Colt stayed on the property those last days. He slept in the lean-to and didn't make anything out of it, just appeared with his bedroll and said there were some fence posts that needed setting and it made more sense to be on site. She didn't argue. She was glad of his presence in the way she had stopped being embarrassed about being glad for. Plainly, without qualification. The night before the hearing, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the fire with Edmund's watch in her hand and turned it over and over the way she always did, feeling the familiar weight of it, the scratched casing, the small, dented place. She heard Colt's boots on the porch. A knock, even though the door was open. "You're up," he said. "So are you." He came in and sat on the opposite side of the fire, and for a while neither of them said anything. The fire was low and steady, the kind that had been burning for hours and had settled into itself. "I keep thinking about what Edmund was carrying," she said eventually. "All those years. Building that vault a little at a time, keeping it from me, keeping it from everyone." She shook her head slowly. "I don't know if I'm grateful or angry." "Can it be both?" Colt asked. She considered that. "Yes," she said. "I think it can." He was quiet for a moment. "He protected you the best way he knew how," he said. "Maybe he should have told you. Maybe that was wrong of him, but the intention was right." "The intention was right," she agreed. She set the watch on her knee. "He knew I would fight for it. He knew I'd find the key. He knew, somehow he knew, that even if the worst happened, I would still be standing." She looked at the fire. "I just wish he could see that he was right." Colt looked at her across the low fire in the small repaired cabin on the land that Edmund had chosen for exactly this moment, and he said, "Maybe he can." She gave him a look that was somewhere between fond and skeptical, because she was not a superstitious woman, and Colt knew that, and he lifted one hand in acknowledgement. "Poor choice of words," he said. "I just meant, he knew you, Margaret. Whatever he could and couldn't see, He knew you well enough to build all of this around what you would do. A small pause. That's not nothing. She looked at him for a long moment. The fire between them shifted and settled. No, she said. It's not nothing. She put the watch back in her pocket, stood up. Her knees hurt and her back was stiff from the cold, and she was 68 years old, and tomorrow she would walk into a room with a territorial magistrate and present her dead husband's documents and reclaim what was hers. And she felt, underneath the tiredness and the grief and the long, difficult months of all of it, something that was simply and stubbornly and unmistakably alive. Get some sleep, she said. We have an early start. Colt stood, settled his hat, and went back to the lean-to without fuss, which was exactly what she needed him to do. She lay down on her blankets, closed her eyes, listened to the fire settle into coals. She was asleep before it went dark. The hearing took less than 2 hours, which was not how she had imagined it. She had imagined something more prolonged, more contested, more dramatic in its resolution. But the magistrate, a thin, precise man named Harlow Vane, who had apparently seen every variety of frontier land dispute in his 20 years on the territorial circuit, looked at Edmund's documents for perhaps 15 minutes, asked her 4 specific questions about the notary's identity and the date of filing, compared the deed against the township record his clerk had pulled from the county ledger, and then looked over his spectacles at Silas, who was seated across the room with his own hired lawyer. The deed to the eastern parcel, Magistrate Vane said, was filed in the territorial record 11 years prior to the date of your father's death, Mr. Ashcroft. It was filed under your mother's name as sole owner, without encumbrance, witnessed and notarized by a certified territorial officer whose seal I am looking at right now. He set the document down. There is no legal ambiguity here. The question of the estate's claim to this parcel does not exist, because the parcel was never part of the estate. Silas's lawyer leaned in and said something quietly. Silas said something back. Vane watched this exchange with the patience of a man who had waited out many such exchanges and was prepared to wait out more. Furthermore, Vane said when the exchange was done, I have before me a deposition from your father's former business associate, a Mr. Gerald Fitch of the county seat, who states that he was witness to 2 transactions in which you, Mr. Ashcroft, represented the title of the eastern parcel as part of the estate you were disposing of, specifically in negotiations with the Callaway Timber Concern and separately with a Mr. Duncan of the River Trading Post. He folded his hands on the table. Representing land you do not own as land you do own for purposes of financial negotiation is a matter the territorial court takes seriously. The room was very quiet. Silas said, I wasn't aware. You were the one doing the representing, Vane said. Not unkindly, but with a finality that closed the sentence. The hearing ended. The main estate question, which Vane agreed to review given the questions now raised about Silas's handling of the broader estate, was set for a follow-up proceeding. Silas left the room without looking at Margaret, which was the last time in her life that she would see his face, though she didn't know that yet. She walked out of the magistrate's room into the gray May morning with the documents in her hands and Colt 1 step behind her, and she stood on the wooden walkway in front of the settlement's meeting hall and breathed the cold air and looked up at the sky, which was doing nothing dramatic, just sitting there, pale and ordinary and real. Well, Colt said. Well, she said. He looked at her. How do you feel? She thought about it honestly. Tired, she said, and hungry. She tucked the documents inside her coat. And ready to go home. He nodded once and went to get the horses. The ride home from the settlement took longer than the ride out, not because the road was different, but because neither of them were in any hurry. The gray morning had opened up into something warmer by midday, the kind of May afternoon that the frontier occasionally offered as an apology for everything it had put you through. Pale blue sky, the smell of thawed earth, and new grass coming up along the trail, the light falling sideways through the tree line in long, pale columns that made even scrub pine look dignified. Margaret rode Ida at the walk and let the horse set her own pace. Colt rode beside her without talking, which she appreciated. She was not done thinking yet, and she needed the ride to finish it. What she was thinking about was not Silas, or the magistrate, or the documents now secure inside her coat. She was thinking about Edmund, She had been thinking about Edmund in different ways since January. First with the raw grief of someone who had just lost the person they organized their life around, then with the quiet ache of someone learning to take up the space that person left, then with the complicated mix of gratitude and something like anger that had surfaced when she'd understood what he'd hidden and why. But what she was thinking now was different from all of those. She was thinking that Edmund Ashcroft had been a man who loved his family, all of it, even the broken part, and that he had spent years quietly preparing for what he hoped would never happen, and that the preparation had cost him something. You don't build a vault in secret without carrying the weight of why you're building it. He had known about Silas, and he had chosen to love him anyway, and that had been both his greatest quality and the thing that had prevented him from simply fixing the problem directly while he was alive to fix it. She didn't think he was wrong for that. She understood it, which was not the same as agreeing with it. Loving someone difficult is not a flaw. It just leaves certain work for other people to finish. She had finished it. "Colt," she said. "Yeah, I want to do something with the land." She had been working toward this thought for days, but it had taken the hearing and the ride and the afternoon light to assemble it clearly. Not just survive on it, not just make it livable for me. She looked at the trail ahead. There are people in this territory who are where I was in January. Widows, children nobody claimed, families that had one bad season too many and lost everything they'd built. She paused. Edmund left me enough to do more than just keep myself fed. And this land, it's not as worthless as Silas thought. It has water, it has shelter, it has room. Colt rode beside her for a moment without responding, which she had learned meant he was taking the thing seriously rather than answering fast. "You want to build something?" he said. "I want to build something," she confirmed. "What kind of something?" She had thought about the word for it and hadn't found one that fit cleanly, which told her it was probably a new thing rather than a version of an old thing. "A working ranch," she said, "with a proper bunkhouse, with kitchen gardens big enough to feed more than one person, with the kind of setup where a family who has nothing can come and work for their keep and learn what they need to learn to eventually have something of their own." She adjusted her grip on the reins. Not charity, work, for real pay, with real prospects. Just a place where the door isn't shut on people before they've had a fair chance to earn their way. Colt was quiet for another stretch of trail. "That's going to take a lot of building," he said. "I know. The vault? The gold? The silver? It's enough to start, but building what you're describing, that's a years-long project." "I know that too." He looked over at her. She caught the look from the corner of her eye and held it briefly before turning back to the trail. "You're not asking my permission," he said. "No," she said. "I'm telling you what I'm going to do, because you've been part of this from February, and I think you should know what you've been part of." She let a beat pass. "And because I could use your help, if you're willing." He didn't answer immediately. She let him sit with it. The horses moved through a stretch of shadow where the trail ran close between tall pines, and the air went cooler for a moment, and then they came back out into the light. "My spread is 4 miles northwest," he said. "That's a workable distance." "It is. I'd have to bring my operation over eventually. If I'm going to be useful to what you're building, I can't be splitting my attention across 4 miles every day." She had not expected him to say that. She kept her expression level, which required some effort. "That's a significant thing to consider," she said. "I've been considering it since March," he said simply. "I just didn't have the right shape of what I was considering it toward." He looked ahead at the trail. "Now I do." She did not say anything for a long time. The trail bent northeast toward her property line, and she could see the ridge beginning to rise through the trees, and somewhere beyond it, the outline of the cabin roof that was whole now because Colt Mercer had climbed onto it in February with cold hands and put it back together. "I'm not an easy woman," she said. "I want to say that plainly. I know that. I have opinions about how things should be done, and I'm usually right about them, and I don't back down easily even when I'm wrong. I've noticed. And I am 68 years old." He glanced at her. "I can count too," he said, with the same flatness she'd used against Silas in the yard, which made her want to laugh, and she let herself, briefly, because they were alone on the trail and brief laughter was not a crime. "All right," she said. "Then we understand each other." "We do," he said. They rode on. The summer that followed was the hardest and best summer of Margaret's life since the early years with Edmund, when everything had been difficult and new, and full of the particular energy that comes with building something from nothing with your own hands. The first thing she did once the legal matters were fully settled and the main estate's fraudulent dealings had been laid out before the magistrate in the follow-up hearing was have the vault's contents properly documented and assessed. A man from the territorial land office came out with a clerk, and they spent 2 days cataloging what Edmund had accumulated: the gold coins, the silver bullion, the fur bundles, and most importantly, the land grants, which turned out to cover not only her current parcel, but 2 adjacent tracts that Edmund had quietly secured over the years and folded into the same vault-kept documentation. The total was more than she had let herself fully absorb when she'd first seen it by candlelight underground. It was enough to do what she'd told Colt she wanted to do, and then some, if it was managed carefully and not wasted on things that didn't hold value over time. She was careful. She had always been careful with money because she'd spent most of her life not having enough of it to be careless about, and that habit didn't change because the amount changed. The bunkhouse went up first. Colt's men did the frame, and she directed the interior layout with the specificity of someone who had thought about it in detail for weeks. She wanted real walls between sleeping quarters, not just curtains, and she wanted a proper kitchen separate from the sleeping space, and she wanted good ventilation under the roofline because she had seen too many winter illnesses start in stuffy closed rooms. Colt's carpenter shook his head at the ventilation requirement and said it would make the structure harder to keep warm. She told him to figure it out. He did. The kitchen garden expanded to 3 times its original size, running along the full south-facing slope where the afternoon sun held longest. Ruth Ann Collier came out on 3 separate occasions that first summer, ostensibly to help with the bean mounding she'd mentioned in April, and actually to be the kind of neighbor who shows up without an invitation and works alongside you all day and tells you what she thinks about the spacing of your root vegetables with the blunt honesty of someone who considers politeness less useful than accuracy. Margaret did not mind. She adjusted the spacing. The first people to come were not who she expected. She had imagined, when she'd described her idea to Colt on the ride home, that word would spread slowly, that she'd have months to get the structures ready before people started arriving. But the frontier does not operate on the timetable you set in your head. Word moved faster than building materials, and by July, before the second bunkhouse quarter was even framed, a woman named Clara Briggs, no relation to Harlan, just the same common name the territory seemed to produce in abundance, arrived with 2 children, a mule, and a letter from the settlement's minister who had heard about Margaret's project and had apparently decided she was a better option than whatever he had to offer. Clara was 34 and looked 50, which was not a judgment on her but an observation about what the last few years had done to her face. Her husband had died of a fever the previous winter. She had been staying with relatives who had been patient but were running short of it. She stood in Margaret's yard with her 2 children, a boy of 9 and a girl of 6, and looked at the half-built bunkhouse and the expanded garden and the lean-to with Ida and 2 of Colt's horses, and she said, with the careful dignity of a woman who had been practicing how to ask for things without sounding like she was begging, "I heard you were looking for people who could work." "I am," Margaret said. "I can cook, and I can sew, and I can manage livestock well enough, and my boy Eli is old enough to be useful if you tell him what you need." She kept her chin level. "We're not looking for handouts. We'll earn our place." "I know you will," Margaret said. "That's why you're here." She looked at the children, who were looking at Vera the hen with the focused attention children give to small animals. "Can your girl pull weeds?" The girl looked up immediately. "Yes, ma'am," she said, with the earnestness of a 6-year-old who wanted very much to be considered capable. "Good," Margaret said. "The beans need it badly, and I haven't had time." Clara and her children moved into the first completed bunkhouse quarter that week. By September, there were 3 more families on the property, plus 2 single men who had come looking for seasonal work and had been offered something more permanent than seasonal. By the following spring, the population of what people in the settlement had started calling, without Margaret's input or approval, Ashcroft Valley, had grown to 23 people across 4 bunkhouse quarters, 2 additional small cabins built on the adjacent tract land, and one ongoing argument between Colt and his head carpenter about the proper pitch for a new barn roof. Margaret stayed out of the barn roof argument She had opinions about it, but she understood that some arguments needed to run their own course. What she had not anticipated, and what turned out to be the thing that changed the valley more than any structure she built, was what happened when you put that many struggling people in a place where the door was open and the work was real, and the person running the thing treated them like adults who were capable of figuring out their own lives given the right conditions. What happened was that they started helping each other. Not because anyone told them to, not as a policy or a rule, just because that's what happens when people who have each been through hard things find themselves in proximity with each other. And there's enough, not abundance, not luxury, just enough to make generosity possible. Clara turned out to be a remarkable cook who began running what amounted to a communal kitchen by the following winter, feeding the whole valley out of one organized operation that was significantly more efficient and significantly less wasteful than 23 people cooking separately. She did this without being asked because it was obvious to her that it made sense, and because it gave her something that was hers to manage and take pride in. Eli, her 9-year-old who had started the summer pulling fence posts and carrying water, was by the following spring one of the more reliable hands for the younger livestock, which he approached with a patience that reminded Margaret uncomfortably and then warmly of Edmund. The Calloway brothers, who had stood in the yard that day in May, started buying cattle through Colt at prices that were fair and brought other buyers to him, which expanded his operation in ways that made consolidating it with Margaret's land practical rather than just desirable. He moved his spread to the valley officially in the autumn, his 200 head of cattle now grazing the western tract and the lower field pastures that had been cleared of their rocks, and turned, finally, into the productive ground Edmund had apparently always known they could be. The rocks, for the record, made excellent foundation walls. 3 of them. It was not, Margaret would tell you if you asked her directly, a happy story in the simple sense. It was not a story where everything resolved cleanly, and the people who had done wrong suffered appropriately, and the people who had suffered received exact justice. The frontier did not deal in those proportions. Silas lost the main estate in the follow-up legal proceedings. The fraud he'd conducted in representing the eastern parcel was part of a broader pattern the magistrate's investigation uncovered, and it cost him more than just the extra land he'd tried to claim. He did not go to prison because the territorial legal system in the late 1700s was imprecise about what exactly warranted imprisonment and what warranted disgrace, and Silas received the latter in full measure. He left the territory within a year. Where he went, Margaret didn't know. She didn't ask anyone to find out. She thought about him sometimes. That was the part that doesn't simplify into a clean lesson. She thought about him and felt the grief of it, the specific grief of a parent whose child became someone they didn't recognize and couldn't reach. She did not hate him. She tried to, once or twice in the early months, when the anger was high and the wound was fresh, because hating him seemed like it might be cleaner than what she actually felt. But she couldn't maintain it. He was still the boy she'd carried for 9 months, the boy who'd had Edmund's jaw and her stubbornness and some quality all his own that had bent the wrong direction under the pressure of wanting things faster than the world would give them. She had loved him. She still did, in the complicated way you love something you've lost. Not with hope, because hope requires something to hope toward, but with a permanent tenderness for who he had been before he became who he was. She mentioned this to Colt once, late at night, the second winter, when the snow was deep outside and the fire was good, and they had been sitting in the expanded cabin that now had proper furniture and 2 proper chairs and a table that didn't serve double duty as anything else. "Do you think you could have done anything different?" he asked. With him? She thought about it seriously, which was the only way she knew how to think about things that mattered. "Probably," she said. "I don't know what. I've turned it over enough times that I can't see the shape of it clearly anymore." She set down her coffee. "Edmund probably could have answered that better than me. He understood Silas in ways I couldn't reach." "He understood you in ways you couldn't see too," Colt said. She looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means he built a vault and put the key in the one object he knew you'd keep forever," he said. "And he put it on land he made sure would be yours. And he wrote you a note that said you'd know when." He looked at the fire. "He didn't put all of that together for a woman he thought was going to give up." She was quiet for a long time. "No," she said eventually. "He didn't." Outside, the snow came down through the pines in the steady, patient way of things that have all winter to arrive where they're going. Inside, the fire held. The valley grew for years after that. Not fast. Nothing real grows fast. But steadily. The way things grow when the conditions are right and the people tending them are paying attention. By the time Margaret was in her mid-70s, there were nearly 60 people living and working on the land that Silas Ashcroft had thrown away like table scraps. And the settlement 4 miles west had begun to measure its own growth in relationship to the valleys. Merchants who set up because there were customers there. A school that started because there were enough children to justify one. A road that was properly maintained because enough people used it regularly enough that it made sense. Colt's hair went fully gray by his mid-40s, which he noticed in the way men noticed these things, without particular distress, just a kind of mild inventory. He ran the cattle operation with the same quiet competence he'd brought to everything since February of the year he'd ridden up a forgotten trail and found an old woman clearing debris out of a broken-down cabin. He and Margaret argued with some regularity about the management of various things, and they were both usually partly right and partly wrong, which was the honest version of how most worthwhile partnerships work. She was 71 when she finally moved the rocking chair from the main ranch. Not herself. She sent Eli, Clara's boy, who was 19 by then and strong and had the particular quality of a young man who had been given real responsibility early and had grown into it. She told him to go to the main ranch property, which had changed hands twice since Silas left, and tell the current owners that there was a rocking chair on the south porch that had been made by Edmund Ashcroft for his wife in the first winter of their marriage, and that she would like to have it back. Eli came back with the chair. She put it on the porch of the expanded cabin, facing south toward the garden and the lower field and the line of trees along the western edge where the spring ran clean and cold. She sat in it on the first warm afternoon of that spring and felt the old familiar creak of it under her weight. Edmund had built it slightly imperfect, the left rocker a fraction shorter than the right, so it always leaned a little that direction, and she put her hands on the arms where his hands had been when he'd built it, and she sat there for a long time watching the valley that had come from the ground he'd prepared for her. She was not at peace, exactly. She was not at war with anything either. She was somewhere in between, which she had come to understand was where most honest lives end up, not resolved into perfect clarity, but settled into something you can sit with. The grief was still there, for Edmund, for the children she'd buried, for the son she'd lost to his own worst qualities. The satisfaction was there too. The work, the land, the people in it, the fact of having kept going when stopping would have been so much easier. And there was this. The knowledge, which she held quietly and didn't talk about often, that kindness is not a weakness. She had heard that it was, her whole life, had heard it implied in 100 small ways, had watched Silas believe it completely, had watched the world occasionally confirm it by taking advantage of people who gave too freely. But she had also fed a frightened boy in her barn 20 years before she needed him, without any thought of needing him, and the same action that seemed like foolish softness to a man like Silas had turned out to be the thing that kept her alive when the worst came. You don't know, when you help someone, what shape that help will eventually take when it comes back to you. You can't calculate it. The only way to live as if it matters is to give without calculating, which requires a particular stubbornness, the kind that keeps going past the point where a reasonable person would stop. Margaret Ashcroft had that stubbornness in full measure. It was the most valuable thing she'd ever owned, and it had never been in the vault. Colt came out to the porch as the afternoon light was thinning, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He handed her one without asking if she wanted it, because after 3 years he knew she always wanted it, and sat on the top porch step with his own cup and looked out at the same view. For a while, neither of them said anything. Eli was visible down in the lower field, working the fence line with the younger Calloway son. Somewhere near the garden, Clara's daughter, 15 now, and managing the herb section with the organizational intensity of someone who had found her particular gift, was talking to Ruth Ann Collier about something involving soil drainage, a conversation that would probably last until dark. Edmund would have liked this, Colt said. He would have had opinions about the barn roof pitch, Margaret said. He would have been right about them. Probably. She rocked forward and back just slightly, compensating automatically for the left lean the way she always had. The coffee was hot. The air smelled like turned earth and new grass, and the distant piney cold coming down from the ridge. "Thank you," she said. She said it simply, not as an event, just a statement of something true. For coming back in February. For staying. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. You'd have figured it out without me, he said. Maybe. She looked at the valley. But it would have taken longer, and I might not have had the patience. He made the short sound she had come to identify as his version of a laugh. You have plenty of patience. I have stubbornness, she said. People confuse them. They're not the same thing. He thought about that. What's the difference? Patience waits, she said. Stubbornness keeps moving. She took a sip of her coffee. I'm not good at waiting. I never was. He nodded slowly, considering that. The light was going golden sideways now, the particular light of a late spring afternoon bending toward evening, and the valley below them was full of the sounds of people finishing a day's work, the small clangs and voices and animal sounds of a place that was genuinely alive. Margaret Ashcroft sat in the chair her husband had made for her and drank her coffee and listened to all of it. And it was not perfect, and it was not easy, and it was not what she had planned for the last years of her life. It was better than what she had planned. It was real, and that she had learned, through hard winters and broken roofs and vaults full of what the dead leave behind and yards full of people who showed up because once, without calculation, you had shown up for them. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything.